Well, welcome all you wiretappers back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. Got my good friend Camillus Robinson. Welcome, Cam.
How you doing, Gary? Good to see you.
Well, is it cold up there in Chicago? It's colder than hell down here.
Yeah, it is. It was in the teens earlier. I might get up into the mid-20s today.
I see your dress more. Me too. Anyhow, we're going to talk about the big Tuna, Joe Batter's Anthony Accardo today, and Cam and I both stumbled across this little story, and I mentioned to him, and he'd already knew something about it, and it's the little red sports car story. And this is really fascinating, I think. During the 50s, Tony Accardo had the perfect job. He was a beer salesman. I remember as a kid, guys wanted to get a job with the Pearl Brewery or on the brewery truck because you got all the free beer you wanted to drink. But Accardo had it for other reasons. Of course, he was an outfit guy. He was the boss at the time, and he had a lot of connections with Chicago bars and liquor distributors and places to buy beer, wouldn't you say, Cam?
That's where you make the pickup. That's where you pick up the cash.
That's where you pick up the cash, man. That's where the sports gambling was going on.
That's
the
right.
Bookies hung out. That's where the deals were made, and that's where the gamblers were. That's where the money was. And he made $65,000 a year as a beer salesman, traveling around. He also got. Let me look at my notes here. He got 5 cents a case on all Foxhead beer he sold, and so he was working for this company. It wasn't really a mob company particularly, but he was the mob guy representing them. And it probably was more of a mob company we realized. He deducted his expenses and like car expenses and other expenses, depreciated out his car. But what's interesting is his car was a little red sports car, but it wasn't just any little red sports car. Was it? What was it, Cam? I know you're the sports car guy.
As a car guy, I know you're a motorcycle guy, but so for me, the 300 SL Mercedes Gullwing, we know it's a Gullwing because Gary, I wondered for years, Gary found a great quote from the judge talking about the up and down doors. But 300 SL Gullwing was the first supercar. I sat in one at an auction. It's got a steering wheel that tilts forward because it's so hard to get into. So you can imagine these guys in their expensive suits stepping over this wide beam to get into this car with the doors all going up. And it was a race car in everything except name. They used them to race. The handling was tremendous. This was the quintessential. It was like driving around selling beer in the equivalent of a Lamborghini.
Interesting. Richard Ogilvie, who was the sheriff for a while in Cook County, and he was an investigator, and he did some investigation on this, and he went to 3,500 local tavern owners, and he never found anybody that ever talked to Tony Accardo.
That's the damn police work, though, for the day for a local sheriff.
Really, he deducted $3,994 in depreciation and oil and gas expenses for this Mercedes.
I'll pay for the car.
And Accardo, his trial was it was really interesting. He had succeeded Capone, so he was the man, and he knew how they got Capone, right? Income tax. So he had always showed some income and depreciation and some deductions like normal people do. He wanted to make it look as normal as possible. Of course, he lived way beyond those means, but maybe not like Capone did. Hell, Capone, he had these silver diamond encrusted belt buckles that he gave out, and
hotel and
homes, and well, I guess he had a big home down in Florida, and he just did a lot of other real ostentatious things that Accardo didn't particularly do. He did have a home in Palm Springs later on in life, but this Mercedes was pretty ostentatious at the time. What would that car be worth today?
So now they go for about $1.2 million.
Wow.
$1.1 million, just went at auction.
Think if you could find the one that Tony Accardo actually owned. If you could trace that VIN.
Jay Leno's got a red one. Looks something like it. But yeah, it is a tremendous car. If you could trace Tony Accardo's, that would just be maybe an extra $100,000 in the bank.
Oh, or more. I tell you what, I wonder how you do that. You know how you trace those VINs? I know guys do that. They go back and find their high school car that they had. I've heard of that.
If you went down to, you could probably go downtown to the registration road vehicles and maybe track it down. I have a hard time believing that Accardo had too many legitimate records, but because that car was in a court case, I'm sure it would be somewhere.
You might be able to find the VIN in that old court case. And it used real mob fans up there in Chicago and Cook County that like to research. I say, go find those, see if you can find those court records.
There's not a lot of those cars out there.
And get that VIN and then start trying to trace it, or send that VIN to me. I'll try to trace it, at least whatever I can do on the internet. I'm not going to travel around the country, but it'd be worth it to actually travel around the country if you thought you could find it. But even if you found it, even if they didn't know who it was, it'd be hard to buy because they just don't go up for sale. Those
No. People get them, hold on to them.
Accardo's famous for never spending a night in jail.
Mm-hmm.
And in that trial, they put up a pretty good defense. It was a typical Chicago defense. Let me take a look at here. Some pretty good quotes. He got Al Pilotto in there, who at the time would have been, what would he have been at the time in 1956? He was
pretty high-ranking lieutenant down in Chicago Heights. A lot of the Chicago Heights crew, Frank Laporte was running things in Chicago Heights, and Al Pilotto and a bunch of guys, Joe Costello. These guys all were witnesses in this trial. So basically the whole Chicago Heights group, because a lot of the bars that Accardo was supposedly selling to were down in between Kankakee and Calumet City, which is south of Chicago.
Now then that makes sense why Pilotto would be the one that came in. He at the time, he had been the president of the local number 5 for the International Hod Carriers, Builders, and Common Laborers Union.
Yeah.
And he claimed that he was a leg man for Accardo, which is why you didn't see Accardo in these joints. He sent, Pilotto said, I used to go out and do things in these joints and take bar napkins and, little giveaway items and promotional things for him. And he said, and he even remarked that he was in a particular liquor store, the Park Inn Liquors in Calumet City, and he saw Accardo come in with Jackie Cerrone. That's how far back Jackie Cerrone goes. He had to be a really young guy. He must have been like driving Accardo. Accardo, how old would he have been then?
Yeah, that was so he was in his early 50s. He was born in 1906. So in the late 50s, he just turned 50 driving this car. And so, he would have been in his 50s. Cerrone would have been, he was born, so in his late 30s, early 40s.
Okay, yeah, he would have been a young guy. So he'd been going around with Accardo since he was a really young man, carried on all the way to the rest of his life. As long as Accardo was alive, Jackie Cerrone was his guy. That was a long time relationship. I never really thought about that. I know, look at later on in the 70s, when he's sitting up at the Mayo's Norwood restaurant, I think, and he'd sit there, meet with Paul Ricca before he died and meet with other people. Jackie Cerrone was often noted as being the guy that took him there and maybe stayed there, or maybe came back and got him. And so he was with him a long time.
Oh yeah. He was his right-hand man in that Elmwood Park crew.
Yeah. At the time, Pilotto named off his partners in his jukebox cigarette vending company business, so he had a reason to have people going in and out of these bars too. Right. Frank Laporte, like you said, a guy named James Ross, Frank Franz, Mike Roberts, Marty Pusini, Sam Giovanni, and Dominic and William Palermo. I don't really know any of those guys. You know anything about those guys? Yeah,
Toots Palermo was he went down in a big sting. Dominic was Toots Palermo, but there was a lot of trade back and forth over in between Italy and Chicago Heights, and a lot of heroin trade, and they had a pipeline of stolen cars through Altoco, but there was a lot of connections to Sicily through Chicago Heights. Those were all big rigs in Chicago Heights. Parade of mob guys coming in and saying, no, he was a beer salesman.
Yes, really. There was another guy named Joseph L. Costello who was connected. I don't remember that name either. You remember that name?
Another guy in the Chicago Heights. He got up there and verified that Accardo had been a beer salesman down there. That he had been in the bars in Chicago Heights and Calumet City.
And there's a John Macaluso, who was the president of the Kankakee Distributing Company and head of the Chicago Heights Liquor Distributing Company. And he said he saw Accardo and this Joseph Costello many times coming in the sports car on a beer selling mission.
To run an organization like that in the 50s and 60s, you would have had to be on the arm,
When I asked about the little red sports car, Pilotto quipped something about, he sold a lot of beer out of that little red car.
Yeah, not out of the trunk, though. I saw a picture years ago of Accardo's maybe granddaughter, niece or something, driving what was called a Ward Isabella, which is another little German car, a little German coupe. So he might have had a predilection for German cars.
He might have.
Yeah.
Interesting. And back then, that was unusual. That was really unusual. Everybody, if you're going to have a sports car, you probably have a Corvette more than likely. If you had money, and if you didn't have so much money, you might get one of those little English sports cars like you've got.
Right.
You got an MG.
Little MG.
Or a Triumph or something. They weren't very expensive at the time. Of course, you had to work on them every day. But
I'm quite a mechanic, Gary. Let me tell you.
Bet you are by now. During the time, my research tells me that he was paying taxes on income that he said came from miscellaneous sources, which ain't bad, of about $1 million between 40 and 55. And that justified his $500,000 mansion in River Forest at the time, and vacations, and lavish vacations. I think he must have been a golfer. He liked to, because he ended up in Palm Springs every winter.
I wish I could find some miscellaneous sources.
He did this after people started pushing him back in the day as he was coming up about, well, where do you work? Federal agents pushing him on where do you work? And he remembered what happened to Capone. And so that's when he got in the liquor distributing the beer sales business.
It was Capone and Nitti and Jake Guzik all went down for, Nitti and Guzik were in for 18 months, but Capone was who they nailed, and Accardo was scared of that. He sold his house shortly after this and moved into a smaller, still a pretty ostentatious house, but not like that one in River Forest that you and I saw. It was just, what was that, 24,000 square feet or something, just insane. That.
And in the appeal, says the government introduced evidence that he had an employment contract with Premium Sales, and he was reimbursed by the Foxhead Brewery for contract payments to the defendant. But the defendant, Tony Accardo, was unknown and unseen at Premium's office at any times by Premium's office supervisor or any of the salesmen that were in there.
Those guys got in some trouble for stepping up in front of that court and saying, no, I don't know this guy at all. I've never seen him around the office.
Or by Premium Sales bookkeeper who saw the salesman every day. And there were 6 other Premium salesmen that attended salesmen's meetings and salesman drivers and sub-distributors, and nobody could ever say they ever saw Tony Accardo around there.
There's a scene in The Sopranos where Tony Soprano has to show that he's working. He's worried about a tax trial himself, and he shows up at the sanitation place that he's supposedly a manager at, and they don't recognize him. They don't know who he is. And then the owner comes in and says, "Oh no, it's okay. Here's his office over here." And they turned it into a storage closet and all, but nobody knew who he was.
I remember that. Yeah. And then the time I thought it was a little bit hokey, but it was kind of dramatic in a way and kind of funny, is when several of his guys, he got them no-show jobs at a construction job site through the, labor racketeering. And I've heard of that. Same way with the Teamsters, and no-show jobs or minimal work jobs down on the truck docks there in Kansas City.
Laborers too.
But his guys come and they don't work. They take folding chairs in order to show up at the job, and they sit around and sun themselves and smoke and joke all day long. I thought it was a little bit much. They get in some fight with, the regular laborers are mad as hell over this. So I don't think that was based in reality there, that for a no-show job, they just wouldn't show up at all. And
I think that was a bit over the top, trying to drive home the point.
But that's been, that whole no-show job. I just heard a story about a guy here in Kansas City that when he got out of the penitentiary, I'm saying in the 80s, he was going to have to show a job, continue to be supervised for a while, and a local part-time or a local car dealer gave him a job at minimum wage and pay, cut a check for him every week. And they did this for 2 years, and the guy never showed up, never had to show up. But the car dealer got a really juicy contract with another big company to provide some kind of he had a body shop. It was a buy here, pay here car lot, and he had a body shop connected to that and a tow truck. So he got a tow contract with a bunch of other people that he normally wouldn't have got. He also got a deal for a couple of new car dealerships in the city to provide all the body shop supplies. So he went someplace to a distributor, bought them, and then took a little piece off the top and
Right.
sent them those. So that was a deal. That's it's just such a common thing with the mob.
They ran the laborers, they ran the city government. So all those guys had no show jobs in streets and sanitation, or the El Pilotto was a big wig in the laborers, and several of the capos were chiefs of the laborers union.
Who else didn't? Joey Lombardo.
Yeah,
Was
Lombardo
supposed to be somebody's driver up there for quite a while, right. And that finally somebody exposed that. I don't remember how it was exposed now. Do you?
They purged all the corruption from the laborers. I mean, it was a major effort, and they had to fight to get them out. I know one of the guys who was high up in laborers is still around, so I don't like saying this. I don't like to say people's names, but I mean, they really had to work hard to get these guys out and bring in national attention. The government was putting pressure on them, and all. They finally forced them out.
Yeah,
Pilotto was dead by that time, but it was quite a deal.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. Like I said, I know there was a ton of Teamsters jobs here in the Kansas City that they either did little or didn't show. Mainly they showed up but did very little on the docks, and the foreman knew that he couldn't push them. I talked to one foreman.
Oh yeah.
He tried to push this one guy named Beans Inzarello. Can't even remember his first name. And what Beans did is he was part of a crew of mob guys that flew to other cities back in the 60s and robbed grocery stores. Back then, you could rob a grocery store on payday, and you could hit a 5-figure amount in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was a lucrative business. But in between times, he was working on the dock at a big freight company. And this guy just wouldn't do anything. He'd show up, but he just wouldn't do anything. And I talked to a guy years later, there was his supervisor, and he said, I tried to push him. He said that, he even threatened to kill me one time. And he said, I finally, I couldn't get rid of him. So I just finally gave up.
Juiced in.
Yeah, it's an interesting life being in the mob and having those connections. That's one reason people say, oh, they don't hurt anybody else. But, in some ways they do. Think if you're a guy working on the dock there, and you're thinking, well, this guy doesn't do anything, give me his money. I'll work hard, or divide it up among a few of us, let us get a little more money and you'll get more work out of us. But they watch that guy sit on his ass, or they don't even know about the ones that don't show up. So,
right. And then robbing the pension and everything.
The union when they do things like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they really, a couple of those unions. I mean, the laborers and the Teamsters and the dock workers, they just really ripped through there. Did a real number of work.
Yeah, and even businesses, it gives some businesses an unfair economic advantage because they can put pressure on to do that. Now, many times the pressure they put on somebody who bends to that pressure, they got their own little secrets going. They're sports gamblers and, maybe in hock or go in and out of hock to the mob and different things like this. We had a guy once that you always think these kind of square John businessmen are not part of it, and then you get surprised. So a guy named, what was the name of his? Aero Truck Sales. It was a big truck sales. And this was like their vice president or something. This was a pretty high ranking person. And we did a operation on a bunch of, really, they were art thieves is what they were. They were high end boosters. They stole elite crystals. What's the other kind? There's other kind of crystal that people steal. They went to a little museum up in Omaha and got a Remington painting. They went some other smaller museums around and got some paintings. And when we took down, they were mob connected. They mainly fenced through the mob. And when we took them down, was one guy started talking, and he told us he sold this one famous painting. I think it was a Remington, out of a museum to this guy who was the exec at truck sales, went down to his office, and there it is on the wall.
That's brass.
This side by side, in and out, overlapping of the mob, and what seems like on the surface legitimate businessmen is always fascinating to me. It's always interesting, and it's there.
But it's all legalized, and corporations have taken over all of it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's interesting discussion, Cam.
Driving that little race car around.
Driving that little red car around. I'm impressed with him because you, like me, I like my cars and I like motorcycles too. I had a Porsche Boxster for a short period of time.
There you go.
It was a lot of fun. You've got what is your car? Your
little 66 MG midget.
Midget, yeah. Well, those things are small, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. It's not as easy to get into as it was when I was 16, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, really.
Legs don't work the same at 45.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time I see one of these cars, I think I want one. And me and my friend Steve St. John go to every Saturday night. There's a kind of unofficial local people with cars, usually restored cars, show up in a parking lot over here. And he knows several of them over there. And I meet him over there and just go around and talk to those guys and look at these cars. And I always want one. But when you start talking to them, you find out, oh, yeah, I put $110,000 in that 56 Chevy. I put $75,000 in that, 65 Corvette. And that's after I paid $20,000 to buy it.
No comment.
Really?
No comment.
I just think, I like them, but not that much. I wouldn't take care of it anyhow. I like to use things. I don't like to just look at them. All right, Cam. Well, thanks a lot for working with me on this. I think it's an interesting, fun little story, which we try to bring to you guys out there in YouTube and podcast land. So don't forget, I like motorcycles. We just talked about. Look out for motorcycles. Cam's got a book coming out. Tell me the name of that book.
It is Swan Song, The Real Chicago Mob Wife. It is about Lisa Swan, the wife of Frank Calabrese Jr. It's talking about what it's like behind the doors of what goes on in the mob household, not from the point of view of the mobster, but from the point of view of the family and what effect it has on the wife, the mother, the children. And it's really a pretty raw look, kind of like what we were just talking about. I mean, it really takes a toll on family members, and I think this is a pretty interesting look. Lisa Swan tells a hell of a story. And so I think it'll be something. Chicago Swan Song is going to be in the book.
Thanks, Cam. Chicago Swan Song. And if you've got a problem with PTSD or you got a friend or relative that does, look on the VA website and get that hotline because there's help available for you former service people. Thanks a lot, Cam.
Absolutely. Absolutely.